Artificial intelligence. When you hear that, I'm guessing that the first thoughts that come to you are about self-driving vehicles, manufacturing robots, and Alexa or Siri. One thing you probably didn't think about was an AI teacher in the classroom. Well, this shift is underway as students from elementary up to graduate school are increasingly being taught by robots. Companies such as Microsoft and Google have been developing the technology to transform education into a primarily AI-driven space. It's a brand new world. Some see unbridled pedagogical potential, and others see the end of education as we know it. It's a fascinating and confusing space, and here to help us navigate it are Edward Janak, Professor and Chair of Educational Studies here at the University of Toledo, and Pierrette Dagg, PhD student in the Foundations of Education, both who have conducted research on this topic. Thank you both so much for being here today. So, much of what we think of when we talk about AI, I think, kind of comes from popular media, like movies like Ex Machina, I, Robot, I Am Mother. But when we talk about AI in education, that's really not what we're talking about. Can you just give us a brief explanation of what AI means in this space and how we're seeing it applied in the classrooms?
Yeah, AI, the first time we heard that term was in 1956, and it was at a conference in Dartmouth. And at the time, they thought of it as the science of engineering intelligent machines. And we don't really have a set upon agreed definition of AI now, but for a lot of the research that Dr. Janak and I have been doing, we're considering it any non-intelligent or non-human intelligence that has the ability to replicate human mental faculties, to produce natural language progression, to be able to strategize, and to be able to make reasoning about others. And that's used in classrooms today in so many different applications. And the challenging thing is that the majority of the time, 70 to 80% of the time, individuals don't even know when they're interacting with an AI. So in the classroom or online classroom at all grades, we can see this as learning management platforms. We can see this in the nature of chatbots. It's used sometimes to measure network and data traffic, so we understand our students and our schools' bandwidth needs. And then there are also programs and software that can be used to, whether it's online or in-person school, evaluate individual student performance, teacher performance, and district performance.
How about the instruction itself? How's that kind of being outsourced to AI?
That's being outsourced in different ways to every single different school, and it's also being used in different ways and applications in different countries. And that's another challenge, is that a lot of this has not necessarily been pedagogically tested longitudinally for its effectiveness. So we can see this in great ways if we have students who need supplementary instruction, special education, tutoring for people with different needs or advanced needs. So there are programs, there are entirely online teachers and online schools that are powered by AI, but it's all just kind of Wild West greenfield right now.
And I mean, is it technically effective? I mean, does it work doing what it's purporting to be able to do?
What do you mean by effective?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, as in any technology, it's kind of two sides of the coin here, and there are trade-offs, right? You're telling me some of the positives there. Is it being effective at, for example, delivering instruction, tracking student performance, that kind of stuff?
Well, see, and that's the biggest problem. So Tuomi in 2018 said one of the biggest challenges is that AI has the ability to potentially perpetuate bad pedagogical practices. So Dr. Janak can talk a lot about some of the early LMS in the form of standardized curriculum on Sesame Street and the rigorous testing that they put that early childhood education through. And right now this technology is being developed quite oftentimes by people who are not necessarily educators or in the education arena, and it's being given to our students, and there is not longitudinal effectiveness data, so we don't know. If you're measuring effectiveness by graduation rates or standardized testing, the verdict is out on that, but effective versus actually doing the job of education is a different question.
Yeah, and I certainly hear concerns like laden throughout your response there. So I mean, what are some of the problems that this technology creates?
I think one of the biggest ones is going to be around this issue of who owns the technology and who creates the technology. And what we've seen in education is anytime you get for-profit groups coming in and interacting with education, what we need to keep in mind is that when it's corporate America, their motive is to make money. Their motive is not to do right by the students. And there's a long history of really bad effects when corporate America and education get into bed together. And when it comes to AI, this is rife with potential conflicts. One of the top ones off the bat is the issue of colonialism and data colonialism. What data is being collected from these children? Where is it going to? How is it being used? How is it being sold? Joel Bakan, in one of his books, detailed just a very kind of trivial example. A doll was sold that actually had an internet connection that live streamed whenever a child was interacting with it back to the manufacturer, so that they were using it for product testing without the child's consent, knowledge, or the family's consent or knowledge. That's really problematic. And if you think about that, and that was in somebody's home, imagine that being in front of a group of children in a mandatory environment. It's only as good as the programming that goes into it, which, Pierrette can talk about quite a bit. But what we know is that, you mentioned the media representations. What we've studied through pop culture studies is, we have a very distinct view of what being a teacher is in this country. And that is being infused into this for good and for ill. There's these perceptions of what it takes to be a good teacher, which may or may not be accurate. None of this stuff, as Pierrette said, has been tested at all. And whenever we've seen learning systems and learning machines have a long history, but they typically come with a lot of really rigorous testing before being launched main scale. And that's not happening here.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going off script here a little bit, but as you're saying, I'm thinking of kind of other unintended consequences here. And companies are obviously in this space because they find it an attractive market. I'm wondering about, to what degree young children might be being groomed to be consumers of these kind of large tech companies' ecosystems. Is that a concern?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There is a long-standing history with this in
Sure.
education. A couple of examples, Channel 9 schools. Where Channel 9 says we're going to buy a school televisions, put them in brand new TVs in every classroom, and in exchange you have to watch 12 minutes of programming that we generate every year. Well, they did a study that found 9 out of 12 minutes of that programming was commercial based. So yeah, it's branding students from the get-go. Microsoft was another example. Very, very early on, they were quick to donate computers to schools, knowing that when you taught students on Microsoft computers, they were branded. And that's part of why Microsoft is still the industry leader when it comes to home PC use today. And there are some potential benefits that go along with this, but the question that we have to grapple with now is, do the benefits match or outweigh the potential consequences? And again, nobody's asking these questions, which is really, really troubling. Another aspect of this, for example, they're experimenting with an iPal robot in classrooms right now. And again, the upside is it can be multilingual. It can provide a lot more one-on-one for students that a teacher wouldn't necessarily be able to do. There's one classroom I was in that had 7 different languages spoken in it. No teacher can be expected to do that, but an iPal can. But it was also programmable by the students. So, if you think about all of the things that students do to each other on social media, imagine them being able to get their hands on an instructor and what could possibly come out of that.
I think there's the other thing that I think is really important to mention is the propensity of AI to perpetuate racism and implicit bias and marginalization of women. That's one thing that's not been tested that we really need to consider when we're bringing any of these in. So right now, as of today, 88% of the developers of these AI are white males, which is not in itself, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's been demonstrated that unintended bias and institutional racism are perpetuated through the programming. And one way that we can do this is an example that everybody is likely familiar with. In 2015, Google Photos labeled African Americans as gorillas, and that was released to the public. And the reason for that is likely because of a low amount of racially diverse data when it was placed into the base level programming. And we can see that with not only with race, we can see it with gender, we can see it with social class. And that's just one example, and they learned about it and they worked to correct it. But how are these other things that are maybe perpetuating unintentionally some of these biases being identified and then being reconciled?
Yeah, and based on my limited understanding of AI, it's hard to identify those things. Thus far in our conversation, we've really focused on the student experience of AI, but I want to spend our last minute here talking about the kind of from the teacher's perspective. So, and just ask kind of the question that I think everyone's worried about. Should teachers be worried about their job security here?
Absolutely, yes. No doubt in my mind. Since the 1980s, there's been a strong anti-teacher movement. It's been infused with a neoliberal ideology that's taken over education, wanting to privatize it and drive teachers out. And AI is just another mechanism that those with this neoliberal agenda can use to get teachers out. Plus, we haven't even started talking about the ethics behind it.
That's one of the biggest challenges, is that the International Society for AI in Education is the standard global organization that considers the integration of this technology in all areas of education, and they aren't talking at all about some of the ethics.
Well, that's a scary note to end on, and that is all the time that we have today. Thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And this is our last Rocket Talk of the season. We've really enjoyed bringing you UToledo's expertise to help you make sense of the world today. Thank you to WGTE for hosting us. And we also want to give a shout out to our director, Kevin O'Korn, for his work on the show this season. We'll see you next season on Rocket Talk.